Okay, let me finish up just briefly a couple of items from our last time together. We remember we had those different spheres of influence in the world up here. You know, business and education and all of that. And so we were talking about what it means for the church to lead in those areas. And part of what I wanted to say is here's some specific reflections in terms of questions that can help us gain some traction as we participate in these various spheres of influence. What does it mean for the church to lead, and what are the kinds of ways we get into that kind of mindset for participating as the kingdom builders in that area? And so here's just a few questions that will help us gain traction when we're involved in that process. The first one is this. We ask, what does goodness look like here in this particular field? I mean, goodness has a quality of its own, but what does it specifically look like in this particular area? You know, whether it's business or education or professions or something. What does goodness look like in this place? What is its function? What is right in this field, in this area? What is right, and what do we aim for in that? And then the second question is, how does this area or function sustain or promote or protect the common goods? Because most of the time what we've understood is some of the shift that's happened in our culture is that we no longer see these things in our participation, these things as preserving the common good and serving the welfare of others. We see them as a means to personal gain or achievement or accomplishment or wealth or whatever it happens to be. And so the service aspect of our engagement in those things has kind of diminished. And so I mean, we've talked about that education before, and this is why you don't want to be part of the educational or academic field, because you have all these committee meetings you have to go to, and committee meetings in academic settings are just frustrating because you just sit around the table and talk about ivory tower, you know, talk about just kind of abstractly thinking and talking and sharing and so forth. But then you have to come to grips with the fact that, you know, the people that you're pouring your life into to have a particular major, you know, and a qualification in that major and an understanding of that major, and even proficiency, if you're talking about graduate studies, a proficiency in that particular area, and you realize that the likelihood is that they're not going to be employed in the field with which they graduate their major. You know, I mean, some are, obviously you have to if you're building on a particular professional career, but for a lot of the people, they're not going to end up working in that field anyhow after they've put all this time in. After you've invested your life into them, it's like, well, because that particular field may not pay enough, you know, for them, and so they have to find something else to do. I was reading an editorial yesterday in the New York Times that was interesting, caught my attention. It says, "I teach the humanities and I can't tell you their value for humanity." I was like, really? Did you see that article? That was an interesting article. It says the person was just saying, you know, I understand why humanities gets chopped off as the first thing to go when the colleges and universities are, you know, bleeding money, because I can't tell you their value either, and I teach it. And I was like, oh my gosh, maybe you shouldn't be teaching it. But maybe some of the reasons why is because they have people like you who don't understand what humanities is all about teaching. But anyhow, so goodness and the common good, how does this particular area, and how do we then as servants engaging in that, how do we help it accomplish its purpose to protect or promote or provide the common goods for society? Another question to ask, how does this area, and my participation in it, how does this area contribute to flourishing? What does flourishing look like in this particular area for humankind? And how do we bring that about? What does it look like as it's accomplished? And then a personal reflection that we have on that, then how does God's will inform this particular area? How does my understanding of God, how does God bring life through this in the area. And a lot of this you can find in just the history of God's interaction with people, because all these particular areas, maybe not in specificity, but at least in the general broad range of things, can be found in the history of God's people. How did God feel about government? How did God feel about economics? How did God feel about education? How did and you can find evidence for God's mind in all of that, and how that was brought to life in that particular time. So how do we transport that and help that come alive in our particular time and engagement with that? And this is I note that this is a personal reflection, because this is not something you want to bring up at your corporate meetings. Well, what does God's will have to say? Unless you work for World Vision or something like that, then that's acceptable. But they're probably not crazy about this down in Amazon. Well, how does God's will inform what we're doing here? Well, maybe we shouldn't work on Sunday. Although that's neither here nor there. But I mean, Amazon or any of the other things, you can't just introduce that. So you have to think about that for yourself. So how am I guided by God's life and will and purpose as I pursue this field? And then maybe you need to think about as you're working through that, who can help in bringing this about? Who can help, or who needs to help for this to really work well? How do we need to intersect with other groups? What perspectives are necessary here? What groundwork needs to be laid? Interestingly enough, that perspectives can be very, very they're obviously very helpful, but dialogue with other people, Proverbs says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And so you have this conversation with other people who can bring to light things that you don't think about because of your particular perspective, and theirs brings it out. And that's happened to me time and again. I've been in conversation with people and made a statement, and then somebody has responded to that and say, well, I think this has actually happened. Something I've been concerned about, and I think it's very true. I think this is the way you see these things, and suddenly it's like, yes, you're right. I've been so narrow in my understanding of that. I haven't considered the bigger picture. So sometimes we need that help in order to make progress in these particular areas. I keep, this is a blank board, but we'll fill it in later for the so so what groundwork maybe needs to be laid for these things to happen? What can we build on? What's here that we can use in this particular area or field? And then, importantly for people who are kingdom people, how do I pray about this? And that's a critical component. We'll come back to that at the end of our time together. But how do I pray about this? Man, if you and I as Christ followers would be serious about this aspect and do it, particularly for the way we work. I mean, really honestly, if we believe that Jesus is I'm getting ahead. I'm giving you the end already. If we truly believe that Jesus is the Savior of the world and the King of creation and the most intelligent, thoughtful, loving human being that ever existed, human person that ever existed. We think he's the smartest guy. Then he knows how to do your job. He knows how to do these things in all of these fields. So we should be engaging him as a partner in that. How do I do this? And what do I need to see about this? You enter into this conversation with Jesus as you go about these things. How are we doing this? And in some of these it'll be more important than others. But how would Jesus do this? How would Jesus handle this person? How would Jesus approach this issue? And if you don't know, then that's the conversation that you have, Jesus, I know you know what needs to happen here. So how do we do this? Help me see this. Open my eyes to this. And when you begin to have that conversation, you begin to see, you begin to get answers back. And you'll get, a lot of times people say, well, God never speaks to me. And I says, well, how often do you speak to God in a way that would make a difference? And I don't mean that pejoratively. I just simply mean that a lot of times we pray very safely. Because A, we don't want to be disappointed, if we don't hear back. Or B, we don't want to betray our ignorance, and as though we're kind of, shielding God from our lack of understanding, as though we think God doesn't know this. But the point is, how often do we pray in ways that we would know God was answering? And that's how we have to begin to do this praying business, is pray in ways so that when God answers, we know it. All right. So that was how we can, begin to think about our participation in these different areas and all the subcategories that came out of that. How do we bring the kingdom perspective and ourselves into that process and begin that actual intentional way of bringing kingdom values to foundational truths in those particular areas. And so then the last point about last week, and that section is you align your strategy then. As you work through those questions, then you align your strategy with the scope that's in front of you. And so, what I mean by scope is your sphere of influence. So obviously you have, a personal sphere of influence. It could move to communal, and then to corporate, and then to regional, and then to global. And we have to let God worry about, how big that scope will get. We just need to be faithful within those particular spheres as that scope opens up. So, in your personal life, you begin with yourself and your sphere of influence, turned outward towards the world. How do I live in these ways to bring the kingdom into actual, intentional, tangible experiences for myself, but primarily for the benefit of others. And how do I do that? Either within, as a practitioner in one of these areas, or just in my relationships with people. And you begin with your family, obviously. That's the one place where you can safely do these things. So you become this person in your family. Remember, we talked about the role of the church as a kind of a laboratory, as a place to practice these things with a safe environment. And then you can begin to take those into the world, into your work world and your relationships. You can have a communal strategy. How do we, as a group, perhaps affinity groups that form, that take on focused issues or projects? Then how do we bring that into those particular communal groups and inspire that? Take leadership in those situations, and there's lots of those. Opportunities in our world, in our church life, but even in our community life. There's lots of places to be engaged in very specific ways in promoting a cause or a purpose or an issue. And then the corporate, you're talking about a corporate existence. So your sphere of influence might expand. Maybe you're a manager. Maybe you're a project leader. Maybe you're a vice president. Maybe you own a particular company. So you have some self-sustaining enterprise that creates a kingdom culture within itself. Depending on, maybe in your department, it's a kingdom culture, and people start saying, I wish I could get transferred into that person's department, or like Hobby Lobby is an example of that. I mean, they have a particular corporate culture based on kingdom principles, and not everybody who works at Hobby Lobby is part of that, and not every customer who comes in subscribes to that either. But when they do, they're exposed to that particular kind of cultural awareness that Hobby Lobby is trying to promote as a company. Now, you may not agree with everything that Hobby Lobby stands for, or you may not agree with their particular brand of Christianity. You know what? The Lord doesn't care. Really, honestly, the Lord doesn't care whether they are right or wrong according to your assessment or mine. The Lord loves Everybody. And so, so they're doing what they can do, what is theirs to do, to bring about what they are convicted for in terms of that particular enterprise. So they have the ability to do that, and they do that. And people can say, well, I don't agree with that. And it's like, well, fine, you don't need to work here. You know, I mean, they probably wouldn't say that. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that they're, as a private entity, are able to do. So we prefer to work this way. So we're doing that. How does that look like in the way, in the influence you have in the particular business environment you're in? Regional, you could be an area that's not particularly, you know, specifically defined, but within proximity of your, you know, residence or your work or whatever, you can network with other groups. You offer vision for equitable outcomes in you know, among various communities. You know, maybe the interchange between government, corporate, business, whatever. But you can work perhaps as a connection between those things as you have that opportunity. And then who knows, globally, I mean, my goodness, you could be involved in international relations based on harmony and peace. You can do what you can to bring about flourishing and sharing. And you think, well, that's all well and good, Frank, you know, that we can do that, but none of us are going to do that. And then I would say, how many of you watched any of the Rosalind Carter funeral or anything like that, or read anything about it? So here's a person who went through all of these, all of them. Started out as just a person in Plains, Georgia, living a life as a follower of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus. Then got involved in communal kinds of things, you know, community project because of her church and faith and all of that. Then, you know, married Jimmy Carter, went to Hawaii and all the other places that they went to in the Navy and had, you know, those kinds of adventures, so forth. But suddenly, he decides to come back to where? Back to Plains, Georgia, to run the family business. So what does she do? Disappointed, but she comes back and becomes the bookkeeper at the company, at their business. So they're running their business on kingdom principles. You know, so we've got personal sphere of influence already. We've had communal. Now we're having corporate, you know, just their peanut farm and all of that. But they're running it by the thing. What happens next? He becomes state senator. Then he becomes the governor. That's a regional influence there so she becomes involved in those issues and then suddenly what happens? He becomes the President of the United States, the leader of the free world. And she's his active partner in that, and decides to do what? Become a first lady with purpose, not someone who's just going to host teas. You know, be the hostess at teas. She wants to have an active engagement. So she takes on causes, primarily mental health, but takes on causes and works internationally on kingdom principles. Now, when she was a teenager in Plains, Georgia, she might have been sitting in a Sunday school class like this, you know, and maybe had somebody talk about global, you know, influence, and she would not in that moment have thought, well, one of these days I'm going to be the First Lady of the United States and I'm going to be involved in world peace issues. She didn't know that. Who did? What was her role? To be faithful. To be faithful. What does that mean for us? We don't know what the future, you know, will hold. And who we're influencing. Yes, maybe we're not those people at this moment. Maybe, you know, maybe we are, but maybe we're not. But maybe we have a connection to somebody who is in that formation stage and who is still, you know, someone who could go through all these levels. We just don't know who we're influencing. We just don't. And our role is to be faithful to what God has shown us and what our part is, and then let God worry about the scope. And it's happened before in countless ways and with countless people. We just happen to know of how it happened in this one particular life we've talked about. But that's been duplicated in ways that only heaven will be able to say. So that gives us great hope and confidence in God who is leading our thought and time. Okay, that's that theme. So now we're ready to address the last one, which I've done before. So it'll be a review for some. But this idea of beauty, blessing, and truth, and I want to unpack that a little bit. Where's my little? Well, I guess you're just going to have to take good notes.
Got some pens back here. Do you need a pen?
I need something black. I have orange, but I need something dark. I don't think orange is going to do it.
I haven't tried it, but I'll grab another if we need.
All right. So this is the idea. And you've heard me say this before if you've been in any of my other classes, so you can participate as we have opportunity. But beauty, blessing, and truth is, and I'll just, acronym BBT on this, and we know what we're talking about. But by the way, this is beauty. I have told you that I write in tongues, so you do need to have an interpretation on some of what I'm writing. So beauty, blessing, and truth, and this is a particular order that we're talking about. We're talking about this is an approach, a strategy for bringing about this kingdom purpose in the world. That first, and here's the summary already. The first is we display the beauty of life in Christ. We display that in the way we live our life and how we help other people live that life, and then we are partakers and distributors of blessing. The blessing of living in this kind of beauty has a blessing attached to it that is not only for ourselves but for others. And we don't just hold it for ourselves, and we don't just give it to others, but we invite others to be part of distributing that blessing. So we say, come participate with me in this action, even though they're not perhaps followers of Jesus at this point yet. But we invite them to be participants in distributing the blessing that Jesus gives. And they gain the sense of what that means and what it feels like to be part of that process. And then they begin to crave that for themselves. They want that until they get to the point that says, I want to know the truth behind your life that produces this. And then when they are compelled to ask about this, they're ready to come to this place. They're ready to adopt this. They want that truth that you live by to be the truth they live by. And it won't be like one of these, by the lapels, who can hang on longest in the argument kind of a thing, come to Christ or go to hell. That's how we normally picture that equation, but it doesn't have to be that way. This can be help me know how you live, and what that takes. Too often we begin here, and we promise this, but first we battle on this. And we do get them by the lapels, and we do have these, arguments and these kinds of things, and we have these battles over truth. What's your truth? Well, my truth. What shatters that? Reality. Reality does. And what you're doing, what is truth? Truth is the actual depiction of the reality that you're living or the issue that you're facing. That's what truth is. And so you're living this, and it produces this, which then gives as a benefit this, which leads to more of that, And so this becomes that equation that helps us to spread this kingdom life beyond ourselves. So this is actually a strategy that Jesus used, in his life.
I have a question.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about the truth, starting with the truth being got you by the lapels, how does that translate into beauty?
That's what I'm saying. We have often started here.
Yeah.
That to me, I'm saying that's a mistake.
Yeah, okay.
So what I'm saying is this is where we start.
Okay.
This is where we start. And it leads to this that doesn't have to have that kind of a response. Okay. So this is why we get bogged down here, because we start here. and then it doesn't lead to that. So yeah, let me do this. That will make it a little bit clearer. So, but you know, Jesus had that particular strategy in his own life. I mean, the writer of John helps us with that, even in John chapter 1, passage you all know about, a verse you know. In John 1:14, you know this verse. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, what did we see? Well, first we saw the beauty of his life. And then what happened? We received the blessing of his life, the grace that came through his life. And what did that verify and confirm for us? It confirmed the truth of who he was and who God is. See, the most important part of that is who is God according to Jesus. Who is God according to Jesus? And so the writer of John got that right in terms of this is what we understood about Jesus. I mean, you know, when people would say, and especially as he describes some of the earlier accounts of the disciples coming, you know, where they go to others and say, we have found the Messiah. You know, we have found the Messiah. They said, well, who is he? And what did they say? They said, come and see. Yeah, come and see. Experience for yourself. Experience for yourself. Because it wasn't like, well, I'm going to, you know, and they tried it with Nathaniel, right? Nathaniel, we found the Messiah. He's from, you know, Nazareth. And Nathaniel almost misses it, you know. He goes, nothing good ever comes from Nazareth, you know. So he said, okay, fine, give him a chance. Give him a chance. You know, we're going to see. So Nathaniel shows up and Jesus says, hey, I saw you under the fig tree before Philip came to talk to you. He goes, wow, you are the Messiah. It's like, Jesus is going, stick around, stick around, stick around. That was chump change. You know, that was nothing. Wait till you see what's happening. So anyhow, so this is how Jesus did it. This is how we should approach things. So the thing is that as followers of Jesus, we're always engaged in every aspect of this. And every part of this is always true in our lives. You know, to some degree. It's not like we have to just forget about this and this while we work on this. Okay? As we're living in the power of the Spirit, then all of these things are true of us all the time. And so we are more than able to respond wherever we need to in this equation with whoever we're with. It's not like somebody comes to us and wants to know the truth and we have to go, oh, well, gosh, you know, I'm still in the beauty piece here. I don't know about this piece yet. I can't, you know, let me call Pastor Dan, you know. Why don't you have a conversation with him, you know? No, that's not the answer to this. We're always engaged in every aspect of that. We live outwardly a display of that beauty. Our lives produce a tangible benefit, you know, to other people. And perhaps maybe that's the one that we need to work on more, you know, because it's to have some kind of an external and internal touch point with other people. They are supposed to experience I mean, wouldn't it be great? I mean, I have a section in my Bible, not this one, but the one I use at home for devotions in Colossians, where it's describing the community of people and, you know, they're forgiving, they're kind, they're genuine, all this. And I have written in there, how could you keep people away from a community like this? You couldn't keep people away from it if it was genuinely happening. You couldn't. People love that. They want that. You know, how could you keep it? They'd be breaking the doors down to get into that kind of a community, because that's the blessing, the tangible. I receive. I'm refreshed when I'm part of that group, and then we're always living in reality, a foundation for life that's livable and desirable. A phrase that I often use about this is that we demonstrate the sensibility of living in Christ. That is, and that's a different approach than, well, this is the truth and you need to live by this. It's like, well, I mean, it is that, but that's going to produce this kind of argument. What you do instead is what? Demonstrate the sensibility of living by this. And then you don't have any argument because people see this. And so they want to know this and so forth. So we demonstrate the sensibility of that. And that's what we pray about a lot of times. Help me to live authentically and genuinely with awareness of your work in my life.
Frank,
Yes.
just a little question on the order that you're going. That reminds me of that statement, preach or share the good news, use words when necessary. That's kind of what that
Yeah.
description. But I wonder, as I'm listening to this, I just want to say, too often, I'm going to try to act, to try to display beauty and blessing better, which is kind of like you were talking about putting on the Superman suit.
Mm-hmm.
As we consider what we're learning here, how do we make sure we're not putting on the Superman suit?
Well, some time ago, we talked about humility as the foundation for how we approach these things. We have to convey or cultivate a humble spirit about this and realize that it is not about us. So it's not about us trying to be these ways. That as what is our effort aimed at? Our effort is aimed at getting closer and more engaged with God. And so as we live more into the love of God, then who we are in that process kind of loses importance. And we become non-aware, non-self-aware, non-self-conscious in that sense of how we are accomplishing this. We come back to that Matthew 25 passage of the sheep and the goats, you know. When I was hungry, you fed me, and thirsty, and they go, when did that happen, you know? Oh, it was just because in the course of your life, you were living out the sensible thing to do in the moment as you came across it. That's what happens. And so, and you're not self-conscious about it. And it's not like we have to look up in a particular book, what do I do at this particular moment? It's because the closer we get to God, the easier this becomes in the way we live our lives. We just don't even think about it. We just don't think about it anymore. This is, and this is a bit of heresy on my part, but what I'm about to say is a bit of heresy, so you may want to turn off the tape, stop the tape. And I say this with members of session. I say this with members of session in class, so you know how to get rid of me if this is too heretical. But I think that the more you live in this equation and the more you strive to live in the center of God's love for you, the less preoccupied you are with sin in your life. It just falls off. It just sloughs off. It doesn't even become an option for you. Now, I know that's not good Reformed theology, because good Reformed theology is you're just your heart is an idol manufacturer. That's what Calvin said. Your heart just manufactures idols all the time. And I understand that point of view. And I understand the point of view of people who have to always reason about what terrible, awful sinners they truly still are. And I don't disagree with any of the theology of that. But what I'm saying in terms of practical living, the more you live into this in the love of God, the less you think about these other things. They just don't become an option for you. They're just not in your realm of choices, for the way you live. I mean, even Paul talks about the Romans 7 thing. A lot of people go to Romans 7. Well, he says, the very thing I don't want to do, I do. And the very thing I do want to do, I don't. So who's going to deliver me from this body of death? Then he says, thanks be to God for, Jesus Christ and so forth. And what Paul is talking about in Romans 7 and in all of those places where Paul talks about this, the battle of the flesh and so forth, this is not some evil subversive nature that lives inside of you, some power that you have to constantly work against. The flesh is just simply a life that is separated from God. And you can live in the flesh as a follower of Jesus if you live as though God doesn't exist, or as though God doesn't have anything to say in your life. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, who are so engaged in the practice of religion, understand how I'm using that word, that they can actually come and be part of a church community and go through all this stuff like that, but still live as practical atheists the rest of their of their week. They come and do the religious thing on Sunday, but then God never enters their thought on the rest of the week. And that's, then they're living in a world that forms them. I mean, we're all being formed, right? We're all spiritually formed. Nobody is not spiritually formed. The question is, who's forming you? You know? So they are living in a world that is forming them to act in ways that are consistent with a culture that is based on the fact that God has nothing reasonable, rational, or interesting, or necessary to say about how we live life. And so they adopt those ways, which become natural ways for them to think and behave and interact and engage and so forth, except when they come to church on Sunday. Then they have to really work at not engaging in those practices, you know. But the rest of the week, it becomes natural. So we live as human beings partly by habit. We have to. Otherwise, we just wouldn't be able to manage all the choices that we'd have to make every day for everything. So we live by habit, and the body learns to do things on its own so the brain can be free to think about what I need to post on Facebook. So we live by habit. Well, the problem is that it begins to act automatically. And it does things just, you know, when the stimulus comes, it reacts the way it's been habitually trained to do, because that's just in the way you think. It's automatic. You don't have to think about it. This is what Paul is saying. So Paul is saying that the act of spiritual discipline is to disengage from those automatic responses, and this is why the disciplines are important, not in and of themselves, but as a means to training yourself in a different way, to training yourself differently. And once that training has been completed, or pretty much underway and no big thing, you don't need the discipline anymore in that way, you know, because the effect has already been happened. So for a person who lies on a regular basis, what's a good discipline for that? Well, yes, but I mean, silence is actually the way. Silence is a way to practice that, because what do you do then? You pause before you speak. And sometimes lying is so automatic in people that they're lying before they even begin to speak. But if they've practiced the discipline of silence, then they think before they speak. And then, you know, they can make a different choice. So once that habit has been broken, it's not an automatic response on their part, then the silence perhaps slips away as a need to be so regular or frequent in your life.
But practically for me, and forgive me, I'm always trying to be practical, I remember you said about the disciplines that it's making space for God in our lives.
Yes.
Intentionally making that space instead of me even reaching to God. It's just beginning with making space, and that is a blessing to me to consider that.
Sure. Well, and there's no harm in continuing to practice disciplines as long as one understands the role of disciplines. That they're not merit badges. You know, it's not like when we show up, you know, St. Peter, you know, where's your entrance pass? Well, look at these merit badges. You know, I got them all. Yes, sir.
Brother Lawrence, which I'm sure you've probably read some of Brother Lawrence, and his talk about sin. He says, you know, when I sin, I just turn to God. So he doesn't, you know, beat himself up or anything. He just turns his focus to God, which is essentially what he's known for, is focusing on God. So that's a way of not having sin rule your life, but turning to God for the truth.
Yeah, there was a nun who was being taught by Thomas Merton about prayer and silence and focusing on God and centering prayer and things like that. And she just couldn't get it. She just could not get it. You know, it was 20 minutes of silent, you know, focused, just silent prayer, silence, and centering in God. She goes, my mind is just everywhere. It's just wandering everywhere. And it's taken me, you know, I mean, my mind has gone to 900 different places while I've been in this 20-minute thing. And Merton said, 901 returns to God. What a marvelous experience, you know. And so you put it in perspective. You just say, yes, okay, yes, I can be distracted, but I give that distraction
That's like when you
to God.
read the literature on contemplation and being quiet.
Yeah.
It talks about that very thing. It's always trying to go somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah, they call it the monkey mind. In Buddhism, it's called the beginner's mind. But yeah, the monkey mind is closer to my experience. So, okay, so the heresy I'm promoting is that sin becomes less and less a piece of your life. And you just don't even think about it anymore. You have to actively think about it in order to do it. And I know that is heresy in terms of Reformed theology, but that's okay. I don't always agree with myself. So
one of my sins has been legalism. So my remedy for that is to be more legalistic about my legalism.
How's that working out, Dennis?
Yeah, gerbil wheel here. The remedy is to focus on grace,
yes,
mercy, Jesus, not legalism. We live in a performance society, but more performance oriented than Japan or Korea. And we impose it on our children. I grew up in a legalistic home.
yeah,
Do this, don't do that, do this, measure performance. You didn't do X, Y, Z.
exactly.
And now I'm shrugging off some of that stuff I've been dragging around all these years.
It's hard to do, but it's worth it. It's worth it. All right, let me run back to this here. So we never know, the people that we're engaged with or the communities or the projects or stuff that, we never know where they are in this equation for their experience of God, okay? So we may not be the person who leads them through all of these things, We may not be the one who impresses them with beauty and then leads them to the truth. It just may not happen. But that's okay, because God will bring somebody into their life who can do that. And so sometimes that's our prayer, is God, I'm not able to speak to this person or have this kind of influence with this person, but you know who does. You know who has influence with that person. Please, make that happen. Make that encounter take place. Bring that person into their life or into their awareness, whatever it happens to be. On the other hand, we may be this person, so we just don't know. We just have to be faithful in that whole process. So how do we cultivate this axiom in ourselves, for the collective benefit of the kingdom? And so let me just share a few ideas here in our closing minutes here. How do we cultivate this axiom? First thing I'm going to suggest is you develop a sanctified imagination. Develop a sanctified imagination. Begin using phrases like, what if? Or why not? Or how about? Or consider this. A lot of times our imaginations are hemmed in, by our cultural expectations or our even religious, kind of constrictions and so forth. And we're not allowed to dream into the fullness of what God might do, And so, so I'm asking to develop a sanctified imagination. Let what you know to be true of God guide your imagination of what that might mean and how you live and interact with others. How might God become real to this person? How might God's will become actively part of this process? And Peter is an example of this when he was called to the bedside of Tabitha. Remember in Acts. So he's in the area, Tabitha or Dorcas, depending on your language translation. So so she dies. And the people in her household realize Peter's in the area, so they call for Peter. And so Peter comes and he says, so she died. She's up in the other room. And I think Peter's in his mind going, So why did you call for me? You know, what do you want me to do? You know, so he goes up into the room, and the Bible tells us that he prayed. And I imagine he's praying in that prayer, God, what am I supposed to do in this situation? What do you want me to do? And I wonder if Jesus just simply said, remember the little girl? Because Peter was in the room when Jesus raised that little girl from death. He says, remember her? Just say what I said. Just say what I said. And I'm here with you in this process. And so I can't swear that that's what happened, but that's my sanctified imagination at work. Saying this is the conversation Peter had in prayer, and Peter gets up from there and says, and it's interesting when you go into the original language, you see he uses the exact same phrase that Jesus used. He says, Tabitha, get up. She does. Does Peter know that before he starts to pray? I don't know that Peter knows that this is what the outcome will be, but it is the outcome that happens. And you know, I'm not suggesting that we go into the morgues, you know, in our area and pray this. We've not been called to do that. Peter didn't do that. Peter got called to this moment, you know. So when we get called to these moments where people just ask us, you know, to be involved in this process, issue, or with this person, maybe we need to do more praying about that before that happens, and just simply say, God, what do you want to see happen in this moment? And how do I do that? How do I do that? So we develop that sanctified imagination. Second idea here, assume an audacious posture. Too many times Christians are not very confident in themselves. And there's a difference between being confident and being arrogant. People are arrogant, easily arrogant, but they're not always confident. So I'm asking you to assume an audacious posture. If you serve a God for whom nothing is impossible, then ... You know, what can transpire from that? If you serve a God for whom nothing is impossible. If Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, then what does that mean? How can that, you know? If you believe that Jesus spoke and taught the truth, then what does that mean for the way you live your life and how you do? When Jesus says, love your enemies, what does that look like in your life? What does that look like? If you believe Jesus taught the truth, what does that mean? If Jesus said to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, then what does that mean for how we pray and what we desire? So you assume an audacious posture in the sense that you know that the God of creation, you are engaged in that life, and that the energy of that God is at work in your life. And you and God can accomplish more than you on your own, for sure. So develop a sanctified imagination, assume an audacious posture. Third point, pursue a conspiracy of benevolence. A conspiracy of benevolence. And what I mean by that is a conspiracy is always kind of a secret thing, right? And so if you just create the sense in you that you will always look for a way to be benevolent in any situation, be an ambassador of goodwill, you know, try and find the way to say yes to this person, to this challenge, to this issue. This is something I've lived by for a long time. You know, how can we say yes to this? How can we say yes to this? Even if it's something that you would initially say, no way, we're not going to be, no way, that, you know, but how do we find a way to say yes to this? Because what does Paul say? Paul says, you know, Jesus is what? God's yes to everything. So how do you say yes to this person, to this challenge, to this issue that's in front of you? And you cultivate that sense of how are we benevolent? How can we be this way? And then finally, you just practice an inclusive approach in that everyone belongs, right? Everyone belongs to God. Everyone matters. Because if someone doesn't matter, then nobody does. Everyone matters. Everyone matters. Everyone is welcome into what God is doing. And we have to be that doorway to that introduction. So this kingdom stuff that we've been talking about is not about grasping for power to coerce or control. There are people in our culture right now that masquerading under Christian flags that are grasping for power. That's not what this is. That's not what this is. Because God's love is never coercive. God's love is never coercive. It's about persuasion by demonstration. It's this equation. It's compulsion. We just make it so attractive that people cannot resist knowing, what it is. So the question we're left with is, what's possible under God's direction and power? What is possible? What is ours to do in bringing heaven to earth? That's a huge question. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. He also said, when you ask anything in my name, I will do it. I will do it. Anything in my name, I will do it. So my closing question to you, and we'll end with this. Should we take him up on his promise? Should we do that? Hey, thank you very much for your kind attention in this. You are released from being here at 9 o'clock in the morning.
And Frank, when do we intend to return?
Well, I have in mind January 7th, if that works for
We'll
you.
look at January 7th, and that's just letting everybody know this is our last Sunday school
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
year.
Yeah.